Good morning and a very warm welcome to all the participants to this seminar on globalization, trade and the Indian economy post COVID-19. We've got two eminent speakers to guide us as to what we can expect in the coming days. But just before that, I would want to spend 2 minutes on the Bombay Chamber of Commerce and Industry. As a lot of you would know, we are a 183-year-old organization, and we specialize in a lot of stuff for the industry and commerce in particular. We do advocacy of various kinds. We look at labor advisory services. We do mediations. We do seminars such as this one. Over the years, we've done a lot of seminars on various topics and published white papers. Since right now, it is not possible to do seminars off-site, we have now gone into webinars. We've done around 5 or 6 webinars in the past 7-8 days. And in the coming months, we plan to do a lot of these to bring various information to our members. The other thing which we do is we issue certificate of origin to all exporters. And we are happy to announce that we are probably the first ones to start digital certification as of yesterday. A lot of our members have already availed of this, and I would request anyone else who believes that this is something which they urgently require to contact the Bombay Chamber, and we'll be happy to do this. Regarding labor advisory services, there are a lot of cases which have come to us now since there are a lot of cases with COVID which would happen. And a lot of arbitration is being done by us. Similarly, there's something on mediation which we opened some time back, and that is something which would be of great help in the coming days. I'm sure once things open up, people won't want to get stuck in courts on various cases, but would prefer mediation. Please contact the Bombay Chamber and we'll be happy to take care of this. Coming back to today's topic, let me introduce my speakers. We have Mr. Dr. Rajat Kathuria, who's the Director and Chief Executive at the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, New Delhi. He has over 20 years experience in teaching and 15 years experience in economic policy, besides research interests on a range of issues relating to regulation and competition policy. He has worked with the World Bank, Washington, D.C. as a consultant and carried out research assignments for a number of international organizations, including ILO, UNCTAD, Learning Asia, World Bank, and ADB. He has published in international and national journals, besides in popular magazines and newspapers. He is founder member of Broadband Society for Universal Access and served on the board of Delhi Management Association. He is on several government committees and on the Research Advisory Council of SBI. He has an undergraduate degree in economics from St. Stephen College, a master from Delhi School of Economy, and a PhD degree from the University of Maryland, College Park. So welcome, Dr. Kathuria. We also have with us Dr. Sachchidanand Shukla, who is the Chief Economist of the Mahindra Group. He has over 20 years of experience spanning capital markets and financial services. Prior to joining the Mahindra Group, he was associated with Axis Capital, earlier known as ENAM, as Chief Economist. His key areas of research have been financial markets, strategy, development policy, program, implementation, and impact evaluation. He has a PhD in financial economics from Birla Institute of Technology and postgraduate qualification in business management, finance, as well as in economics from the University of Mumbai, and has been a recipient of KJ Somaya Gold Medal. He is currently a part of Niti Aayog's panel of economists and have been a part of a planning commission, World Bank study, Maharashtra Development Report as an external expert. He is keenly associated with academia and is a member of the board of a leading private university in Mumbai, and has also authored a book for a BMS course of University of Mumbai, besides publishing several research papers. He has also been a keen participant in research seminar, conferences, and discussions on macroeconomics across the forums. Dr. Shukla is currently chairperson of the Banking, Finance, and Economics Committee of the Bombay Chambers and Commerce, and is a member of SHM Shadow Monetary Policy Committee. Welcome, Dr. Shukla. Dr. Shukla would also moderate the questions at the end of the session. Just before I hand it over to both our panelists, I would just like to point out Dr. Kathuria, that yesterday's Guardian has published a report on China now going into digital currency. So they are testing it in 4 different regions. The digitization was already there. So there was Alipay and WebPay and everything else was there. But now they're experimenting with digital currency as a mode of alternate payment. How would that also impact? Because I'm sure they have a head start on some of these issues. So over to you, Doctor, and thank you, participants.
Thank you so much, Mr. Khosla. Good noon, everyone. A very warm welcome to all the participants today. And what we're going to have and we're looking forward to is a lot of insights on international trade, globalization, etc., which is the domain of Dr. Kathuria, and he's done a lot of commendable work. He's also been associated with the policymakers and has real life experience, or in economics you require not just the policy perspective but also some real life experience, and that is what he brings to the table, and is a very renowned name in this particular domain. What I'm going to do is over the next couple of minutes probably just walk you through the backdrop of what we're going to talk about today by way of some interesting charts and slides. Is it visible?
Yes.
Perfect. So I think this is something that has come up from the WTO, its latest World Trade forecast. What you can see here is actually the trend growth. The dotted line tells you the trend growth between 1990 to 2008. And it was growing at a CAGR of 8.5% plus, which essentially is doubling almost, every decade if it continues for a longish period of time. But thereafter, because of the GFC and after that, it started to fall. And what you see in the optimistic scenario, you can see the green one, which is optimistic scenario. The World Trade Organization expects growth to fall, world trade volumes to fall by 13% in the optimistic scenario. In the pessimistic scenario, they expect it to fall by about 30 to 33% in 2020. So this is the shape of global trade, and I just spoke about volumes. The other thing is global world trade volumes have been linked to the global GDP growth rate as well, right? You can see both these lines. The blue line is world trade volume growth, and the red one is world GDP growth. And you can see that there has been a linkage between these two, and they have more or less worked in tandem. But as you go towards the extreme right, you can see the relationship breaking down significantly. And this means trouble, because we know this is very likely a global recession scenario. And also world trade volumes are going to fall, as I said, in the most optimistic scenario by 13% and the pessimistic scenario by 30 to 33%. So this is something that we need to be cognizant of going forward. Another aspect of what is happening is global flows are likely to plunge. So what you can see on this chart now is that the green line is the portfolio flows, which comprises debt as well as equity flows. And these are gigantic. This was about $55 trillion in 2019. And this is likely to plunge by about 80%. And that's humongous, right? Similarly, FDI, the other component of flows, is set to decline by 35%. And it used to be at around 1.4 trillion in 2019. And the last aspect is remittances, the red line, which is set to fall by $100 billion in just one single year, which is the total quantum used to be $554 billion in 2019. And this is likely to hurt India as well. We have actually consistently been the largest recipients of remittances, and our remittances are estimated to fall about 23% to $64 billion in 2020. Now, one thing I want to remind all of you is that while that number in nominal terms is huge, the bar on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, you see that as a percentage of GDP, and thankfully, our dependence on remittances is not as large as some of these other economies, right? It is just under 3%, and then therefore we are not really likely to be hit as much by the remittances, but we will nevertheless be hit by the fall in FDI and the portfolio flows, which is significant. So I think with that sort of a backdrop, I will just come back to our speaker today. This is just the context, and I would just request now Dr. Kathuria to speak on the topic for some time, and then we'll probably have a discussion around that. Over to you, Dr. Kathuria.
Thank you, Dr. Shukla. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to Dr. Srirangan and to Mr. Khosla as well for hosting this session. And also let me at the outset, thanks to Geeta for organizing this, and I've been in touch with her on the telephone. I hope I'm audible. Can you hear me?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll make, as Dr. Shukla said, I will make a couple of introductory remarks, and he set the tone really well for what is happening in the global economy. Just let me add a little bit of background to that, both in the Indian context as well as in the global context, and then I'll hand it back to him for moderation. So look, if we look at forecasts for GDP growth across the world and for India in particular, you recognize that, what a difference a quarter has made. We were quibbling about in November whether we will grow at 5.8% or 6%, or will we grow at 7%. Today, those numbers seem so out of whack with the reality. And the IMF has forecast a couple of weeks ago that India would grow in the region of 1.8, 1.9%. Even that today, I think, seems a little optimistic, because that was based on a certain length of the lockdown, and I think the lockdown has been extended. And maybe India, if it just about manages to retain its current level of GDP going forward, will be quite an achievement as well. And the point I'm making is that if we don't fall, then it will be a great achievement. So within a space of a quarter, we have moved from being one of the fastest growing economies in the world, 7%, or even if you take 6.5%, 6%, we went to 2% forecast. And now I think we're looking at much more dreary forecasts of even trying to maintain where we were. So that's the background in which India is coming out of. The second thing, as Dr. Shukla was saying, is that what is the role of trade in all of this? And if you look at India's sort of engagement with international trade, and let me give you by way of a background as well, those of you who were around in the 70s and 80s would have recognized that we had policies of export promotion and import substitution. And we soon recognized in 1991, which was our big bang license Raj reform that we did, and I think it was for the good that we did it. We realized only then that, look, import substitution and export promotion are policies that are conflicting, and they cannot go hand in hand. And this has relevance for what we are going to discuss in the future about global value chains, etc. But the point is that India's exports today have a huge component of imports, or what economists call backward linkages. So backward linkages since 1991 for India's exports have grown steadily and are very high. And that is what has given us what I would say competitive advantage. No country, no man, no individual, no state is an island. We can do some things well, other countries do some things well, and we collaborate and are able to attain competitive advantage. That's how India attained competitive advantage. And that's why India has been able to engage productively, I think very, very productively, in international trade since 1991. Today, roughly 35 to 36% of our economy, excluding FDI, consists of foreign trade, both goods and services. And China is our largest trading partner. And you should park that also in your minds when we engage on this topic of international trade, is that one of our largest trading partners used to be China. And today, unambiguously, China has become our largest trading partner. I mean, disregarding the EU as one country, we say EU is multiple countries. So if you disregard that, then China is our largest trading partner. And that we should park at the back of our minds when we engage in this discussion. So India engages in international trade a lot. There are FDI flows which benefit the country not only through the magnitude of the flows themselves, but as you would appreciate, by the fact that we are able to also get foreign technology into the country. And what it would cost to develop everything on our own is going to be very, very high. So that's the background. Really, India's growth has been moderated. We'll be happy to achieve even maintaining our rates of growth, and our engagement with international trade, especially after 1991, has been very high. And we will need international trade. We will need the rest of the economy if we are to aspire to become the fastest growing economy in the world. We will need the global economy, and I'm happy to elaborate much more on this. Coming back to the slides that Dr. Shukla showed, and you see a certain break in the volumes of trade post 2008 and now. And I won't go through the numbers, but I just want to give you a sort of analytical insight into what's different today and what was different in 2008. 2008, the global financial crisis that started in North America and spread to the rest of the world, I think it was more or less, people have agreed that it was a demand shock. And given that it was a demand shock, it affected international trade a lot. And international trade is much more volatile than GDP because of the existence of global value chains. And I'm happy to discuss this also in the future. The fact that you have complex and integrated global value chains makes it much more volatile on both sides of GDP. If GDP grows, international trade is likely to grow faster. If GDP falls, international trade is likely to fall faster. And that's because of the integral components of global value chains in international trade. Today, trade is falling, and as Dr. Shukla said, the optimistic scenario 13%, the pessimistic scenario 32%. And if you compare it with the fall during the financial crisis, which was about 15%, today we are looking at a much larger number. Why are we looking at a much larger number for the decline in trade volumes? Is because it's not only a demand side shock that we are seeing essentially a supply side shock, which is that factories have closed down, manufacturing is closed down, it has affected your production, and that production shock has also translated into a demand shock. And the supply side shock is not only a good shock, it is also and primarily a supply side shock as well, because you can't travel, logistics are affected, you have to maintain social distancing. Imagine you can't go to school and college today, you can't have tourism because you have to maintain social distancing. Even if it revives with social distancing, those services are not going to revive in the manner that we saw them earlier. So this time is different, to quote from a very famous book that came out after the crisis. We can say in the context of international trade, this is very different, this is very severe, this is intense because it is affecting goods, services, demand side, and the supply side. The good news, if I were to, and then I'll hand it back to Dr. Shukla, the good news is the fact that we have the experience of the global crisis of 2008. Of course, we don't know so much about the depression because we didn't live through it, we only read about it. But the depression is something also that people are comparing this episode with. But if we go back to 2008 and then look at the global response to 2008, and in the field that Dr. Shukla studies, which is financial markets, it was essentially a financial shock that permeated into the rest of the economy. But the rest of the world got together. The G20 got activated, one of the sort of foremost premier global institutions of coordination. They got together and decided that they were going to do something in the face of a common enemy, in the face of a common shock. They were going to do something to try and revive the economy. So we have the experience of coordination. We have the experience of the G20 before us. And this is also a common shock. This is a global shock. It's a common shock. It might have emanated in China, and there's a lot of politics behind where it emanated, how it emanated, but it emanated in China and it has spread to the rest of the world. China has managed to control it through draconian measures, but they have managed to control it, at least for the current moment. But it has spread to the rest of the world, and therefore it is now something the whole world needs to come together and fight it. And we have an institution. We have the G20, as I referred to. So that's the good news. We have experience. We can tackle global shocks and we can come together and do it. That's why it gives me optimism. No country, just like I had mentioned earlier in international trade, no country is an island. No country can produce everything on its own. Swadeshi may not work in the current context. It's good to make in India. It's good to make for India, but we have to recognize our dependence on international trade and global value chains. And I think the G20 is the institution, given that the WTO is bust right now, I think G20 is the institution that we should look to in trying to find some succor, in trying to find a solution to this global pandemic, which is threatening, which is really threatening to take economies down to 90% of their current levels of operation. Dr. Shukla?
Well, thank you, Dr. Kathuria, for that overview. I think good, we obviously heard the good news that we have that experience of managing something probably not as disastrous, but nevertheless. But Dr. Kathuria, that brings me on to this question on, we are now in an era of what some people call as globalization, right? I mean, we are past the peak globalization. That chart showed or probably captured that. And we are now in an era of globalization. And what does this do? I mean, if you agree with the globalization part, what does this do to common interests, objectives, and policies, right? I mean, everyone in the world now seems to be retreating towards their selfish interests. There is some sort of a fraying of the international order and cooperation that we've seen in the past, right? During GFC, the point that you made, we all cooperated and there was synchronized policy measures taken, which helped the whole world. Today, what we see is, yes, and also I think you mentioned that the scientists are cooperating, but do you really see the economies and central banks really doing the same? Because the virus does not discriminate between the developed and the developing nations. So what do you make of this whole thing about globalization and this imminent talk of deglobalization?
Thank you, Dr. Shukla. So I think deglobalization is something that will happen. And even as we speak, there are countries that are becoming more protectionist. And I will give you examples of where we are becoming protectionist. But I think there is good news. And let me try and frame my answer towards the fact that there is good news. Yes, in the current moment, there is globalization and therefore there is deglobalization. But deglobalization had started happening much earlier than the virus struck. And I think the virus has just intensified the forces towards deglobalization. But I don't think deglobalization or protectionism is a solution for the rest of the world. And let me explain that in more detail. And yes, it will happen, but I think it will run its course. It's also, as you were saying when you were introducing me, you were saying that economics is inextricably linked to politics. And I think what is happening today is that politics is playing out, nationalism is playing out in the rest of the world. And I think it's because, not because of globalization, although globalization has become an easy and a soft target, as so many of us who work on international trade say that globalization has become a soft target for the other problems that the world is facing. And I think two major problems the world faces. One, of course, is climate change, and I don't want to talk about that too much, but that is one. The other problem that world faces is one of inclusion and the one of inequality. And inequalities have reached levels which are almost, absurd and bizarre and almost vulgar, if you permit me to use that word. If you dice up the wealth and the GDP, the flows and the stock, you get a picture of the world which is extremely unequal, and large portions of the wealth are cornered by a very small number of people. Now, you could say globalization has a role to play in that, but I think globalization is being blamed for something that is essentially a national prerogative, something that should happen at the level of the country. But it's no point explaining to somebody who's going to run an election in 8 months or next year that it's not globalization which is really the problem. The problem is your distribution, and it's your tax and redistribution policies, it's your implementation, which is really causing the problem of inequality, and it's not globalization. But globalization has become a soft target for what I think is a failure to implement domestic policies and have good institutions to be able to do what governments should be doing, addressing market failure. And governments haven't been able to address market failure well, whether it is the United States, whether it is India. I don't know too much about China's internal politics, but you don't hear much about how they do it. But definitely markets have been blamed in India for really government failure. So market failure do happen, but I think government failures also happen, and we have to recognize the fact that we need to fix not only markets, but we have to fix government failures as well. So that's my first point on your question. The second point is, yes, at this time, we will see the process of protectionism, and if you were to call it deglobalization, that will happen much more than countries will try and protect themselves. They'll try and secure their domestic constituencies. If you take the example of medical equipment, which is so much in the news, the elasticity of supply, as it were, for medical equipment is low, right? And so every company, even cosmetic companies, are making sanitizers now, right? So you want everybody to make health equipment, personal protective equipment, health medicines, and what countries are doing, therefore, to secure their domestic interests and to shield their domestic consumers from price rises, what they are doing is today they're imposing export bans on export of medical and personal protective equipment, given that the elasticity of supply of these items is slow. I mean, you can't overnight produce more medicines. You can't overnight begin to produce more masks or respirators or ventilators or protective equipment, but it will take time. So existing companies will do it, and then some of the companies that were not doing it will begin to do it. But because there is high demand, and there is no way that you can meet global demand through global supply, countries will try and secure their own interests to export bans. And I think this has a deleterious effect on the global trading economy. One, if I impose an export ban, it becomes logical for the next country also to impose an export ban, what economists call in the international trade arena, what they call is beggar thy neighbor policy. Now, it is a difficult time, and I can sermonize and say this is not a good thing to do. We should allow our markets to be open, but try telling a politician that prices are rising and you need medical protective equipment today for not only your health workers, but if you open the economy today, if you open manufacturing today, imagine the kind of protective equipment that you'll require for your manufacturing facilities. All the industrial workers will need to wear those gowns and personal protective equipment. They will need to wear masks. They will have to have hand sanitizers. And you can't tell a politician today or a trade minister today that don't impose an export ban because it's not good for the global trading economy. So I think this is politically, we must understand that this is what governments are going to do. But we should recognize if one government does that, it's going to be followed by other countries doing that. So there's going to be, just like we had competitive devaluations in the past, which were referred to as beggar thy neighbor policies, we are going to have competitive export bans by countries, which we are already seeing. And hopefully, by the time the vaccine comes out, by the time this gets under control, there will be a tendency to, go back to the old regime. Now, these exports ban that are being imposed and that have been imposed in the past, not only in medical devices and medical equipment. Dr. Shukla and the rest of the members would recall in 2004, there were export bans on wheat imposed by several countries, and there were food riots in the world because export bans were introduced by one country and they spilled over to the other countries. And essentially, they are political. Governments want to shield their citizens, their consumers from the price rise. And they feel that export bans are the way to do it, whether it is food products, whether it is medical products. But I think this is something that we cannot wish away. And frankly, why, if you ask me, why do countries do that? Well, I think, and this is a feature that I think all of you will be aware of, and I think we also going to think much more about this in the work that we do, is that, you know, the global community, despite the fact that we've had years of multilateralism, we've had G20, we've had so many global institutions, but the fact is that when it comes to things like what we are talking about, the flight of trust or the absence of trust becomes so important and so significant that, you know, countries take the knee-jerk reaction. And I'm meaning this both in the current context as well as in the larger geopolitical context, that trust between countries just vanishes. And this is a time when it will happen. I don't trust that if I come to your need now, today, will you come to my need when I need you later? And I think the prisoner's dilemma plays out. It's being played out in oil markets today. It's being played out in geopolitical markets, and it's being played out in trade markets, that I do not trust, China does not trust the United States does not trust China, and there seems to be a collapse of trust in the global economy. And that's why we need, you know, dialogue. That's why you need G20. Of course, this is a geopolitical point, but the point is that yes, deglobalization is happening. There will be intense movements towards protectionism, to protecting domestic consumers, but I think it will run its course. And once the vaccine comes out, things improve. I think we should go back to openness, because the world needs one another. Dr. Shukla.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you made, that globalization is being made into a soft target for local failures, right? But that might precisely happen in the sense, these things, do you think, can get worse before they get better? Because what we are seeing and what we have seen in the past is normally during pandemics, etc., or some major global sort of a crisis, there is a lot of global cooperation, right? I mean, we've seen that in the past. But we are now seeing, and with the US electoral calendar, we are seeing US-China moving towards a conflict sort of a zone. So, I mean, if you have a 20 trillion plus gorilla and a 7-8 trillion dragon trying to fight it out, do you think things will get uglier before they get better? Because you just spoke about some of these positives, but I think the worry is, how do we survive the year 2020?
That, I think, yes, you're right, Dr. Shukla. I mean, there is no doubt. And I think the example that I gave of export bans on medical devices and protective equipment is a manifestation of how things will get worse, in the sense that countries will become more protectionist in this time, before they recognize that either the pandemic, you know, if we take care of the pandemic as a result of the vaccine and things begin to improve, and when things get better, then they will look at opening up much more. But in the short run, I agree that there will be problems. There will be moves towards deglobalization and increasing protectionism. But having said that, let me also mention that, you know, even in the example of medical devices, which are so much, and medical equipment, which is so much in the news today, on the export sides, there are bans, and there is a dishonoring of contracts that have been made by countries. Even Europe is dishonoring some of its contracts, and countries like Germany are not upholding maintaining their contracts. They are not allowing equipment to pass through the Germany to be delivered to Spain, for example. Though examples of those are coming out, but we also have examples of where countries like the United States have reduced their import tariffs on essential items to zero. So masks, ventilators today can be imported into the United States at zero duty. So while you see export bans, you're also seeing liberalization. Of course, this is all in self-interest. This is in countries' self-interest. And whenever self-interest conflicts with global interest, you know that self-interest will prevail. United States has walked out of the climate deal in its personal interest. What Mr. Trump thinks is United States individual interests, and they've put individual interests over global interests. And I think in this situation, in this pandemic, when things are becoming bad, when economies are going to slow down, when GDP is going to fall, I think the natural tendency is for countries to try and secure their domestic market. So we will see a lot of that. And once the pandemic is taken control of, once the pandemic, when the going gets good, we might see protectionism reducing, we might see tariffs coming down again, and we might see a move towards globalization. Because globalization is a given. I think it will happen. It's not that it's going to be completely reversed, and it cannot be. And I think technology is only going to increase the extent of globalization, whichever way you look at it. I don't see globalization is going to I mean, there is a shock, it will reduce, but it will come back. And let me also make a point on your question. And I agree with the premise of your question, as I said, that things are going to get worse before they become better. But the other point is, when things get worse, it's precisely at that point that you want countries to come together and talk to each other. And we have international platforms today. As I said, WTO would have been the natural forum to go to, especially for international trade. But given that WTO has become dysfunctional because the appellate body is not functioning, but G20 exists. And I think G20 has taken cognizance of the fact that this is a worry, this is a common worry. I'll give you an example of where global cooperation, oil prices, there was a war between Saudi Arabia and Russia recently, a price war, and oil prices had gone to zero. Immediately, they got together. They recognized that this price war is going to be mutually destructive. And they got together and talked. Maybe the talks will not come out with a solution. Maybe there won't be a solution because things are going to become so bad in the oil industry. Demand has fallen much more than the supply will fall. So there will be a glut in the market. I mean, they are expecting that there will be a decline of 30 million barrels a day in 2020 for oil. And with that sort of decline, there is going to be difficulty to try and organize quotas across countries, because there will be a natural tendency to try and cheat on the quotas, which is the point I'm talking about, which is the absence of trust. I agree on a deal, and then I decide it's in my domestic interest, or it's my own interest to try and get away from that deal, or to, in economist language, to cheat on that deal, which is what has happened in the past. But so there will be movements towards both at the geostrategic and geopolitical level. There will be a movement in political interest, in domestic interest in trying to secure the domestic market as much as possible. But because this pandemic doesn't, as you were saying, Dr. Shukla yourself, this doesn't recognize borders, it doesn't recognize religions, it doesn't recognize rich or poor, it affects everybody. Then given that it's a common enemy, I think the world institutions will try and come together to find a solution. There will be both pulls and pressures on global institutions, and the test of global institutions will be, or global institutions will be put to a test at this time. We know what's happening to the WHO already. United States is pulling out support from the WHO because it feels that it's become, it has a pro-China bias. And so there's been sort of undermining of a global institution already, and we will see that happening. So there will be both pressures, domestic economy pressures, the pressures towards coordination, and they will all act simultaneously. And one more point in terms of the time lags of how effective is this going to be. Naturally, when you protect, when you deglobalize, when you try and secure your domestic economy, you do it instantaneously, you do it immediately. And for public health reasons, you can always say that I can impose tariffs or I can impose export bans on medical equipment because on public health reasons. And you can do that immediately. But for cooperation to try and manifest itself, for cooperation to begin to play its role, that will take time, that will require dialogue, that will require meetings. So that might happen over a period of time. But I'm optimistic that over a period of time, in the face of this pandemic, we will get global cooperation. And I'm putting my money not on G7, not on WTO, I'm putting my money on the G20.
Interesting. I can see a lot of questions in the question bank now. So what I'll do is probably come to an India-specific question, and then we can probably go on to the Q&A by the participants. Specifically coming to India, what is the price you think we'll have to pay? For example, we have seen India also go back on some of the key reforms that we've initiated since, say, 1991. We've started to raise tariffs just like some of the others. Now, the refrain could be that it is specifically targeted towards a particular country. And part B of the question is, what does this mean for our supply chains? And because this chamber, I mean, we have a large number of participants who are from the medium and small industries. What does it specifically mean for our sort of supply chains? And what are the changes you think you will see going forward from the policy perspective in India?
So I think, Dr. Shukla, what I firmly believe is that, you know, the sort of reform that we did in 1991, and you yourself are aware of this, was limited to largely product market reform. And we got a big bang for our buck on the product market reform. We did delicensing, we opened up our industries to foreign direct investment. What we did not do simultaneously or sequentially, if you will, was other sorts of reforms which are happening today. And you are so familiar with the financial market reform and the banking reform that is beginning to happen, the labor market reform that is beginning to happen. So capital market reform, the labor market reform, the land market reform are all pending, what we used to call post 1991, the second generation reform. And we really didn't see the big bang in the second generation reforms that we saw in the first generation reforms. And the first generation reforms, essentially the product market reform, gave us a big bang for the buck. We began to export to countries that we had never imagined that we could export to. I mean, for example, you know, India was full of people who used to say, including in the Planning Commission, who used to say that, you know, nobody will buy our products. Nobody, we export products that nobody wants in the market. And they are elasticity pessimists, basically, that, you know, agriculture primary product. But we proved them wrong. After 1991, we proved them wrong. No, India can produce for the global market if it is allowed to compete. And you allowed that. So I think India can become globally competitive, and it has to follow the right sorts of policies. I think there is some sort of a knee-jerk reaction that we are unable to compete with China, and that narrative is very strong in India, and that narrative played out in RCEP as well. But I think that India cannot become globally competitive without the international market. And if you just look at the history of economic reform across the world, not just in the United States, but if you look post-World War II in Europe, and especially closer now in China, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, they have all used globalization. They could not, even China would not have become the massive power that it is, that you said, $8 to $10 trillion economy without the global market. And today, India will not be able to become the $5 trillion economy without the global market. You can take it from me that it is the only, we may have a huge domestic market, but we will not be able to become globally competitive without the access to the global market. And that's, you know, brings me to your question on global value chains. I think going forward, especially in the short run, and keeping RCEP in the background, keeping ourselves in the background. In the short run, even in the medium run, there is going to be, and this narrative has already begun to be sort of spoken about, both in policy circles and in the media, that there will be some isolation for right or wrong reasons. There will be some isolation of China, and there will be some sort of attempt towards geographical diversification. People already had angst, and I was talking about this distrust or mistrust of China, and this angst has only become sort of more intensified and more palpable now. It will manifest itself even more. So the point is that everybody will try and diversify, not only India, but I think everybody else will try and diversify. But the problem is that today, and your members will tell you that, global value chains are very complex. A product, a component may enter a border multiple times before it is made into a final product. It comes once, goes back, comes back again before it is made into a final product and then sent out. And so those global value chains or regional value chains are much more complex than they were in the past. So geographical diversification, I think, is a good idea. And it is going to, I think, play out, and there will be political moves towards trying to isolate China. But given that everybody votes with their wallet, and let me make a small digression here, a short digression. I mean, nobody forces us to buy Chinese products, do they? Nobody forces the Americans to buy Chinese products. I mean, they talk about, let's boycott the Chinese products, let's boycott. There would be some spyware, there will be malware in this. When a consumer goes to a mall in the United States to buy something, I mean, he or she is often voting with the wallet. I will buy the cheapest product. You may say it's unfair competition. China got the advantage of globalization. It was unfair. They were not complying with the rules. They got the benefit of WTO. I mean, I'm happy to get into that debate separately. But the fact is, nobody forces me to buy a product. And we buy Chinese product despite the fact that they are, people say they don't last, they are inexpensive. There are all kinds of jokes about Chinese products, but we still buy them. They still export $1 trillion worth. They must be doing something right. So the point I'm making is diversification will begin to happen. Global value chains have become more complex. There will be a geopolitical move towards trying to isolate China, but finding alternative destinations for those value chains other than China is not going to be an easy task. And that's where India comes in. And if I were to make a point that India has missed the bus so many times in the past, Dr. Shukla, we missed the bus when China became a $10 trillion economy and its wages rose. We missed the bus when there was the China-US trade war going on. People said, we want to shift to India. India was not an inviting market. So I feel that we should not lose the bus at this time. We should not miss the bus at this time. Growing isolation, increasing diversification, we should encourage firms to locate in India and try and become a host for those value chains or for those production that is trying to attempt to shift out of China. And they will try and shift out of China. And rather than blaming the national governments in India, that national government, I think the onus is now on the state governments to say, okay, I am going to invite investors. The reform is going to happen at the level of the state rather than level of the nation. And that's where we need much more land, labor reform to happen. And financial market, of course, will happen at RBI national level, but land and labor are subjects which are subject to state legislation. And I think that's where the reform should happen and try and attract some of this investment. Let me make one more point, and this is something that we are working on, and I'm happy to get the views of people who are actually out in the field doing this. I used to teach in a management school several years ago, and Dr. Shukla, you also have a management degree, and several of your members would be a part of the management community and the fraternity. And there was this big sort of movement in production and strategy, especially international business strategy, on what is called just-in-time technologies and just-in-time production. And I think the world is today waking up to the fact that just-in-time, while it sort of becomes less costly and you move down the average cost curve, just in time could give you a big shock if your product, if your component, if your link in the value chain is not there because your value chains are not resilient. So maybe we will try and have some fat in the value chain. Maybe the value chain needs to become more resilient by having some more fat in the value chain. So to sort of put, and we are trying to look how this will play out in the global economy. Will firms have much more stocks of inventories, which they will just in time become a victim of the global pandemic that affects all the value chains? So isolation, geographical diversification, attractiveness of India as a market, we shouldn't miss the bus, and sort of making global value chains much more resilient by trying to increase the level of fat, if you permit me to use that metaphor, in the value chain.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kathuria. I think it was absolutely fascinating as an overview. In the interest of time, I'll just hand it over to Mr. Khosla for questions from participants. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shukla. There are more than 30 questions, so I'm sure we can't take all of them. But let me just go through these and see some of them where you haven't touched upon. Let's say, so one is in the context of business moving out of China, India has not been benefiting significantly out of that. What is lacking for India and how policymakers need to gear up to attract such businesses that intend to move out of China? This is by Indranil Pan.
So I know that name. Hello, Indranil. Good to meet you or e-meet you. I mean, that's a question that we've been grappling with for such a long time, as I said. And if I were to just build on what I said, is that, you know, when Chinese wages went up, they said natural market for companies to come to was India. And we had Foxconn and we had, you know, HTC from Taiwan trying to come, and then Samsung, etc., especially in electronics. And we had some automobile companies also thinking of moving to India. But we didn't get those in the kind of scale that China got. I mean, we've never been able to get, and that's what I referred to in my land sort of reform and labor reform sort of part of my talk. So we recognize that this is the way to do it. And countries like Vietnam and Cambodia and Indonesia and more recently Bangladesh and textiles have been able to attract so much investment. And we've not been the beneficiaries. And the narrative often becomes that, you know, let them come on our terms. And, you know, I've heard this in the ministries so many times, and I'm sure members of the Bombay Chamber of Commerce would have heard this as well. Let them come on our terms. Now that the world needs India, we are in a much better bargaining position. We are in a much better negotiating position. And I think the world said, okay, if you're not going to become, yeah, and they were not asking for too much. They were just asking for reducing the transactions costs of doing business in India. And other countries laid out the red carpet, and firms went there. You know, many of the people who produce in India have gone out of the country because they face problems. I mean, what more sort of evidence would you need of the fact that it's difficult to do business in India when your own companies, when your own producers are setting up firms in Central Asia, they're setting up firms in Africa, they are going to Russia, the steel firms have gone to Russia, they have gone to Mexico. You know, and apart from the fact that there are resources in those countries, it's also the push factor from India. So what needs to be done, I think, as I had mentioned, Indranil, what needs to be done is, you know, at the state level, maybe we can give competitive federalism a bigger boost than we have in the past. Let the states go out and attract investment. Give them the flexibility to do what they're going. Give them the flexibility, because there are states like Chhattisgarh, there are states like Telangana that will be happy to host a lot of these investments. So we have to cut through, essentially, it's the political economy, as Dr. Shukla was saying earlier in the session. And, you know, if we begin to talk about regulation, political economy, taxes, etc., we could take the rest of the day. But I think the blueprint of what we need to do to attract those businesses to India is there. And I think if we lose the bus today and I was talking to Dr. Shukla on an offline call, I think this is also an opportunity for India to reboot itself, to restructure, reboot. One structural reform, 1991, a series of incremental reforms over a period of time. 2020 should be the time when we engage in another deep structural reform. And that should be more engagement with the global economy, not less engagement. It should be more engagement with the clean economy, not less. It should be less of fossil fuels. It should be more of coal. The automobile industry should be given a shock, positive shock, I think. And I'm happy to talk about this later. But I mean, these are the things that we need to do.
Yeah, there are 3-4 related questions. Let me just try and combine them. Suyog Joshi asked that there are some companies which they want to leave China and shift their companies to another country. In which case, would our country's economy recover? There's an anonymous attendee who said, do you think India can have competitive advantage in agricultural trade? Whereas Malcolm D'Souza asked on textile, a similar question, saying that many countries are looking at taking away their orders in the textile industry from China. Do you think India or the Commerce Ministry could do come up with some policy which will help there? Because currently China is manufacturing N95 mask and PPE for Canada, UK, Germany, EU, and a lot of other places. So these are all related questions which essentially term about how can India take away a lot of manufacturing from China, and how can it help either our economy, or what does the finance or the Commerce Ministry needs to do?
Okay, I'll give a very quick, short answer to the question, and then I'll sort of try and build it up and place it in a framework where, that's the way we think about these issues. So I think in agriculture, India exports a lot, and it has a huge sort of competitive advantage in agriculture, and we haven't exploited that enough because we don't have, I think, logistics, warehousing, agriculture, food processing. This is an area that we have yet to see exploited. And I completely agree that agriculture is a place. And this evening, we are doing a webinar where agriculture will be discussed as well. And I encourage all of you, if you want, you can join. Some of our experts on agriculture will be speaking on that. But agriculture is a big opportunity. It is a labor-intensive activity. It's a big opportunity, and we have a competitive advantage. Already our exports of agriculture are fairly high. And agriculture is going to be subject to a lot of technical restrictions, as we've seen in the past. And therefore, India should up its ante and not be very defensive about testing and, labs. Where are those labs located? And I want to exercise my right. And we can be aggressive to some extent, but I think we don't need to be overly aggressive in testing and standardization. We should, comply to global standards and not sort of be defensive about them. One of the lessons that comes from China, really, Dr. Khosla, is the fact that they complied with international standards when they were trying to engage in the global economy. They were not becoming defensive about global standards. They said, okay, you give me a standard, I will comply. You want me to produce a product that makes that standard? I will do it. I am engaging, I'm entering the global value chains. I am entering international trade. I am become a part of WTO. I will more than comply with you. And that's how China did it. And I think it's an experience, it's an example that we could choose to follow rather than say, I don't want to comply with these standards. These standards are discriminatory in nature. They discriminate against developing countries like India, etc. We should comply with the standards, and then the rest of the world will begin to trust us much more than they do now. So I think both in agriculture and in textiles, of course, there's so much literature on how we can become globally competitive in textiles. And I think the answer lies really in labor-intensive textiles. That's where our competitive advantage is, and clearances and scale. We haven't been able to achieve the scale in textile. One of you, Shahi exports, is the one that comes to mind immediately, but there are so many others that we could, scale in textiles is something that we haven't been able to achieve, and therefore I think that's. But the larger point, Mr. Khosla, is one that I wish to make, is that how do you transfer skills, competitive advantage in one area to another? Like, now maybe the world will demand different kinds of products. Post-COVID, there would be demand for different kinds of products. There will be much more digital content that will be sold. There will be much more online platforms that will become important in the rest of the world. Maybe it will be a more greener economy, etc. And those skills should be transferable from doing one thing, and so that we have to be agile in the value chains as well. I saw a question, how agile are our value chains? If you look at Hausmann's product map thesis, and I would encourage your members to have a look at that. It's a really good discourse on how countries can become competitive in areas other than what they are competitive now. How easily are my skills in textile transferred to other industries? How easily are my skills in electronics transferred to other industries that I can become competitive in? And essentially what it says is that countries that have enjoyed competitive advantage in the core, in automobiles, in electronics, in digital, in content, those countries are countries that are easily adaptable, and they can produce things because they already have those skills that are transformative. Unfortunately, in India, and I don't want this to become a discourse on what we need to do on skills and education and so on, but in India, skills, transferability of skills from one end, and your members will know how difficult it is to find people if you are diversifying in the right kind of people in here. So our diversification strategies, our transfer of skills from one industry to another are still limited. So if you're looking at the future, and I would appeal, because I don't have time to sort of complete the argument, but if you look at Hausmann, a big name in this field, product map space, he tells, so how do you move from agriculture to sort of textiles, to electronics, from electronics to 5G related. So those sort of skill transformation, we should invest there. That's where the government should be investing in, not investing in things that the private sector is already producing.
Right. So that partly answers the question raised by one of our members, Ishan Ravesia, who's mostly onto exports and how the government should help. He's also thanked the Bombay Chamber for commencing the certificate of origin. I would just take the last question because there are many questions, and I think we'll forward some of these to you. So Geeta can get in touch with you, and if you can answer them, we will get back to members on this, because we already 2 minutes past 1. I'll just ask the last question, in which I'm asking simply because I referred to it at the beginning of my welcome address. This is from Dr. K.S. Murthy, who says that how do you see the effect of China planning a separate digital currency, ERMB, and delinking with dollar going to have a rolling mass effect on globalization?
So, I'll have to think about that, but let me give you a framework to try and sort of understand, a digital currency or any other currency. There was an episode in, post Saddam Hussein's downfall in Iraq. There was an incident about currency, and I'm not sure of the author of that. Maybe it was Varian, but this was a speech given by the then governor of the Central Bank of United Kingdom. And in that speech, and you could go back and Google that speech, and I'm sure you'll be able to find that. And I think Hal Varian, a premier economist at Google, has also written about this, is what is the core of a currency? What is the core attribute? Of course, we know that, store of value, medium of exchange, and so on. But what is at the core of a currency? And the core of a currency is trust. And that episode when Mr. Saddam Hussein was printing dinars to finance war efforts, and he printed dinars indiscriminately within the country, and there were already existing dinars that had come from Switzerland that came to be known as Swiss dinars. It is the same currency. It is the same face value, 500 dinars or 200 dinars. Post the war, when the economy was beginning to stabilize, individuals began to distinguish between Swiss dinars, which were the same note which was printed in Switzerland, and the same note that was printed in Iraq. People refused to accept the Iraqi dinar, as it became to be called then, as a medium of exchange. They said, no, We will not accept this. We will only accept a Swiss dinar. It's like people in India saying that I'm not going to take a torn note. Everywhere else in the world, even if notes are torn, people accept them as a medium of exchange. It's just culture. It's the culture of trust. And what happened in Iraq at that time was when you transferred to a new dinar, the old dinar, Swiss dinar, exchanged 1:1. The Iraqi dinar that had been printed in Iraq exchanged at a much higher value to a new currency. It was just a matter of trust. And I think currencies evolve today. The dollar's position in the global economy is one of trust. And I think we can have a larger discussion on the geopolitics of trust as well.
Sure.
And how China, wanted to, China still has the ambition that the yuan should replace, and you've been reading about this in the newspapers, in the media in the last couple of days as well. Can the yuan replace the dollar as the vehicle currency in the world? I mean, we're talking about global value chains. 80% of the invoicing of global value chains today is done in the US dollar. So whether it's a digital currency, whether it's a paper currency, I mean, digital is just a form of the currency. So I don't see any difference in that. But the fact that United States started backroom negotiations post-World War to try and develop soft power, not only for, as their economy was growing, but also the soft power, the backroom consultations started with the rest of the world, including with Europe, to try and socialize their soft power, which they succeeded in doing, is reflected in the trust that the rest of the world places in the United States and therefore in the dollar. The flight to safety is always a flight to the dollar. The flight to safety is not a flight to the yuan. It's not a flight to the euro today. It's not a flight to even gold, of course, to an extent, but the flight to the dollar is, and because people trust the dollar, and trust is an attribute that grows and you develop over a period of time. You cannot mandate it. You cannot ordain it. It will happen over a period of time. And I think China has a long way to go in trying to develop the trust. Of course, there's lots of conspiracy theories. The West always tries to, you read magazines, articles, they try to undermine China in many ways. Their geopolitical interests and acquisitions of, territories are given a very, very negative press in the West and in the rest of the world. And there's a narrative that slowly builds up. And China has to try and do the same thing. They're trying to do the same thing with the coronavirus, that they tackled it well, the rest of the world didn't tackle it well. And we are exporting medical products to the rest of the world. And we are being gracious and kind to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is not. They're trying to become, global. They're trying to establish that underlying trust. But it's a long, arduous, and a winding path ahead. It won't happen overnight, is my simple and short answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kathuria. May I now request our Director General, Mr. Vijay Srirangan, to spend a couple of minutes, informing our members about what the Bombay Chamber of Commerce Industry has done towards this COVID-19 initiative and deliver the vote of thanks. Over to you, Vijay.
Thank you, Sandeep. It is indeed my pleasant task to talk a little bit. In recent times, the Chamber, in its own small way, has reached out to 5 different hospitals in the city of Mumbai in the context of COVID. JJ Hospital, NM Hospital in Navi Mumbai, Kasturba Hospital, Sion Hospital and Nair Hospital, to try to use the goodwill of our members who've contributed both in kind and in cash to try to assist these hospitals in their own unique ways. Material include both consumables and equipment. Consumable examples will be personal protection equipment targeted at paramedical personnel, masks, face plates, sanitizers, and material of that kind. Equipment include mobile X-rays to enable transportability within the hospital, analyzers that are so necessary for health assessments, and a host of other electronic equipment to combat this disease. We've also made more than a dozen advocacy sessions in this context, whether it be in matters concerning taxation, whether it be in the MSME space recommendations, whether it be banking or economy related or even policy related recommendations to the government, whether they be a set in the CSR area, and so on and so forth. In addition, we've held over the last 10-12 days a series of webinars, on an average at least one a day, across a wide variety of topics, again covering some of it I alluded to in the advocacy sessions as well. And we will continue to do our bit, courtesy the largesse of our member community, to try to assist not just the end patient in question, but also the helpers who are trying their best to help such patients. Coming back, it is my pleasant task to express a vote of thanks to, of course, Dr. Rajat Kathuria, our keynote speaker, our special moderator, Dr. Sachchidanand Shukla, my colleagues Sandeep, Sugita, who has organized this, Aparna, and our IT colleagues Mahadev and Vikram, who are worked behind the scene to make it work. Last but not the least, all the participants. I will end with 4 lines of poetry that I composed listening to you, Dr. Kathuria, and they wrote, and the lines read this way. Many trade matters were explored today. A broad canvas was lit. Although globalization is taking a short-term hit, sourcing beyond China could be the Indian opportunity bit. A long-term transform bus is here. Let's reform and drive it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good
Thank you,
day.
Dr. Kathuria. It was a pleasure.